What is up? Welcome in to Mock Draft Monday. It's Mock It Like It's Hot, Club Fantasy's weekly mock draft show. I am your host, Ryan Weisse. And folks, we are 100% in crunch time as my camera goes out. You know, that's real cool. We are 100% in crunch time. No idea how that happened. To quote a late 80s song that is probably older than our entire audience, it's the final countdown. We are probably 2 weeks away from your draft taking place, and there is still time to get some practice in, and that's what this show is all about. We are here to make you a better drafter, to get you ready for your draft, and that's why these last couple of shows are very much the standard home league type drafts. This is a 12-team half PPR mock draft. With me, as always, my co-host, Austin Amandolia. Austin, how are you, buddy?
Doing great. Yeah. In the height of draft season, I'm getting my company league set up right now, commissioning those leagues, and excited for some actual football to start soon.
Well, I was going to say, and that's what's happening right now is all the friends and family drafts and all of the company drafts are all getting scheduled right now. And one of the things we like to talk about on this show very much is average draft position and draft strategy. And having just even that little bit of information going into the draft could set you apart, especially in like a company draft where, you know, Dave from accounting doesn't even watch football, but he just wanted to join the league. You could be the one who gets the advantage. And to help you with that advantage, we have one of my favorite YouTube channels, TD Good from TD Fantasy Sports. TD, what is up, man?
What's good, guys? I appreciate being here with Ryan and Austin. These are great guys. I met Austin through the Scott Fish Bowl, and he introduced me to Ryan. It's going to be a fun show, man. I'm excited about doing this mock draft.
I agree. I think we're going to have a great time. And as I mentioned before, the mock draft today is going to be half PPR, 12-team league. We are drafting kickers and defenses, though you don't have to, and we'll probably talk about that later in the show. But this is really modeled after the league you're probably playing with your friends and family. So we are going to jump into it. Let me bring this draft up onto the screen and then jump over here and click Start Draft. Our first drafter is Kevin Coleman from over at Football Guys, and I want to give Kevin a shout out. If anybody missed it, he was the inaugural recipient of the Mike Tagliere, I think it's fantasy, up-and-coming fantasy analyst. I'm butchering the award. Kevin is the shit. Make sure you're following him. He is someone who is wonderful in this industry. And if you play Devy or Dynasty, he's my go-to for Devy and Dynasty advice. Even as someone who's in the industry, I lean on him heavily. So make sure you're following Kevin. He starts off the draft with Jonathan Taylor. And guys, I want to talk to you first. TD, I want to start with you. You chose the 110 spot. I always give our guests the opportunity to pick their slot before everyone else. Was there any thought process between jumping into the 110? Do you have a draft coming up where you're the 110?
No, I don't. I just like to take ugly spots. And
okay.
I don't want the 101. I don't want the 112. If I get them in my regular leagues, that's fine. But I'm not going to draft from them because I feel like those are places where a lot of people draft from.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense. And I like that you said that as you pick the ugly spots. I tend to do the same thing whenever I jump into mock drafts in that I want to go with spots that, like you said, the 101, even up to maybe the 105, your decision's kind of made for you. The 112, the whole draft has to fall, so you really don't quite know what's going to happen. But with a draft pick like 110, you know, half the wide receivers, half the good running backs are going to be gone. So let's make sure we figure out who we're going to take at an ugly spot like that. And Austin, you went a little bit of a different route. You went towards, actually you went 108 right in the middle there. Never mind. I apologize. So.
Yeah, I went the 108, which to me is also an ugly spot. But I picked it for a very specific reason that I'm not going to name because it's about a specific player and I don't want to risk not getting that player.
Perfect.
Nice.
One of you two, I don't know who it is. I hear your draft notifications. If you could just click the little bell up at the top or the whatever the noise is and make the draft notifications off, it would be very much appreciated. But as the draft is going here, I just want to take a look. It's pretty much going to the exact standard that I would expect it to go. You know, 5 running backs at this point, 3 wide receivers. TD's about to make his first pick, but way more importantly, maybe the earliest we've seen this entire season, our guy Joel, and Joel is a big tight end early guy like myself, and he's a big Travis Kelce guy like myself. But TD right away, Travis Kelce, the 6th pick of the draft. So I'm going to start with the question I ask all of our guests. Are you tight end early? Are you stream tight end? Do you gamble with the middle round tight ends? How do you approach the tight end, and how do you feel about Travis Kelce going 6th pick, first round, 12-team draft?
It's all about tight end premium. If it's not tight end premium, I'm fading the position, especially if I've done my research and my homework. I like guys outside the top 12 that has a possibility to come in the top 12, even top 5. But that's year to year. like a couple years ago, it was nobody else that I wanted other than Travis Kelce, maybe Mark Andrews. But this year, I think it's like 6, 7 guys that I'm okay with taking.
And that makes a lot of sense because we saw last year Kelce get kind of unseated as the top tight end in fantasy football. And while he's still a top guy, it kind of showed the weakness, if you will, that other people can kind of take that spot. Austin, we've done these drafts 1,000 times together, but like I said, Kelce, this is the first time we've seen him go this early. I know you've been on board with him going towards the turn. How do you feel about him at the 1-6? In a non-tight end premium, which is a great point brought up by TD that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So,
yeah, I think also it's half PPR. So it's we're not in a full PPR setting where he might have even a little bit extra boost. I mean, if he's your guy, he's your guy. And Joel, we know him, that he is all about Travis Kelce. So like, I totally respect getting your guys out the gate. I don't feel comfortable taking Travis Kelce at the 1-6 just because of I like to get a solid running back early unless I'm at the turn and I know that I can get Kelce and then get a running back immediately afterwards. So for me, I would prefer to get a Derrick Henry, a Naji Harris, a Dalvin Cook. But I respect the decision. And, if you love Travis Kelce, you got to go for it.
Yeah, I want to mention 3 things along with that. And typically I like to let the guest guide the show, but TD hit on something I really want to talk about. Number 1, get your guy always. Have fun in fantasy football, and more importantly, in mock drafts. Mock drafts are about trying out a strategy. And maybe Joel, who, loves to walk away from his draft with Kelce or a top tight end, maybe he wants to see if you get stuck in this early spot. But number 2, TD, you hit on a great point of tight end premium. And I have a theory about tight end premium I want to talk about, but I don't want to be the only one talking. Do you want to go ahead and briefly explain tight end premium to the audience for folks who may not be familiar with it?
Yes, tight end premium is where they put a premium on a tight end as far as catches. It could be first downs. It could be anything within the game that you can get points for the tight end. And a half a point premium really doesn't make me go tight end, but a whole point does. So that's really the difference. So if you're getting a half a point per reception, tight ends usually in a half a point premium get a extra half a point. So to me, it doesn't matter. It's all about the whole point. If it's a whole point premium or less than that.
And I love that you brought up during that same sentence, you said, if I've done my research, and then you talked about if it's half a point premium versus a full point premium. Knowing these types of things is so valuable. And I've seen instances where people don't realize that Travis Kelce in a league I was in with a full point premium last year could have been the first pick of the draft if you had saw how much he was going to outscore the next tight end. Now, obviously, Mark Andrews kind of threw a monkey wrench in that. But we talked about this during the standard draft last week, Austin, and you kind of hit on this in half-point PPR. In half-point PPR or in standard leagues where it's not full PPR, a single touchdown can make any tight end playable that week. And so is that where it lowers the value on even high volume guys like Travis Kelce and, Mark Andrews? Is that kind of what you were alluding to there? Whereas the full PPR and kind of like TD was saying, where they're much more valuable in high volume offenses when it's full PPR?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's kind of why I prefer playing in half PPR leagues in general, is I feel like it creates more balance between the positions overall. Whereas with PPR leagues, you can just get those volume guys and they kind of overtake everything else. But I like there being a little bit more of a challenge and needing to play receivers and tight ends that have the touchdown upside as well.
And then it's been about a month before I've gave you time to talk about this, but you were the person who kind of brought to light, and then you had to miss the mock draft where I did it, where you believe in maybe creating a position where you can start a wide receiver or a tight end and kind of removing the tight end spot altogether to kind of balance out the league, correct?
Yes, I am a huge fan of this setup. I do like recap articles for my home league every week. And I wrote an entire article trying to convince them of why we should do this. And basically the point is, for the past several years, the top 3 or 4 tight ends, they're like top 30 to 40 wide receivers. But then if I have a situation where I could start Brandon Ayuk as my 4th wide receiver or start Cole Kmet as a tight end, I would rather play Brandon Ayuk. It's more fun to me. And I think it balances things out more without taking away the advantage of having one of those elite tight ends. Like Travis Kelce, he's like a top 10 receiver on a regular basis. And so if you get him And like a CD Lamb, you still have 2 top 10 receivers, even if you turn that tight end spot into a receiver flex.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense since what we saw in the draft is I think only 8 tight ends got drafted in that league at all. And so it just kind of eliminates some of the extreme parity. TD, you touched on the tight end premium, and I want to go back to that for one more thing, because one of the misconceptions with tight end premium that I find so often, and I found it in our draft where we drafted tight end premium, is tight end premium makes every tight end more valuable, and it plain and simply doesn't. And one of the things I like to point out is while it makes the top guys that much more valuable, and you mentioned, it moves them up your draft board and you'll start looking at them in round 1, the bottom guys still just don't catch enough balls if it's based on reception where it's going to affect them at all. And so like you mentioned, you and Austin have met through Scott Fishbowl. Scott Fishbowl is a tight end premium. Did you go into that draft, and if you don't mind sharing your team a little bit, did you go into that draft with a bunch of tight ends you wanted to walk away with, or were you just looking at the top guys? How did you address the tight end premium scoring?
It didn't bother me. So last year, I was looking for that. I was like, okay, I need to get a tight end early. But like you said, it didn't make a whole lot of difference. It wasn't enough premium for me. So I just faded the position because I have a lot of guys that I have outside the top 12 that I'm willing to take. So it didn't change my strategy because it just wasn't enough. It's only a half point premium. That's not going to make any difference. Now it's going to make Travis Kelce and the next guy extremely valuable, but that's only 2 spots. And I don't believe that you automatically get those guys, you automatically win.
I love that. And that's the part I want to draw people's attention to is know your scoring, like TD brought up, but know what your scoring does for every player. While tight end premium makes maybe having 2 of the best tight ends really interesting. If you're only starting 1 tight end and you're starting 1 flex, it makes having 2 very good guys interesting. It doesn't necessarily make the bad guys more interesting. And to Austin's point, it makes them top 50 wide receivers. So you're still barely considering them a flex option. So that's just something I want to draw your attention to is just because you see the words tight end premium, if you're playing in that league, that doesn't mean you want every tight end on your team. You probably still only want the top guys. The first team I want to draw everyone's attention to, and I don't think Faith has been a part of almost every draft we've done, if not every draft. I know she works in the election board and can't make it every week. This might be the first time Faith goes 0 running back, and she's the only person in the draft looking at 0 running back. So TD, I'm going to start with you again. What is your take on the 0 running back strategy? And for folks who don't know, it's where in conventional drafting, you're taking as many running backs as you can, as early as you can, because of the depth at wide receiver. Faith has led these great wide receivers fall into her lap. So TD, what is your take on 0 running back, and what is your take on Faith's team as this draft moves forward from the 3 spot?
I love 0 RB. I think it helps protect you with injuries. Not that you know the injury, but it helps protect you with injuries. But in half-point PPR, the running backs have the sauce to me. But it can work. If you get guys that's going to score 10 to 15 touchdowns or wide receivers, it's okay. But that's hard to find. Touchdowns are very volatile from year to year. So I don't know who's going to score a lot of touchdowns at the receiver spot. But running backs, I can tell if you're on the right offense that you can score 10 touchdowns. So me, half-point PPR is the way that I go. I go with running backs when it's half-point PPR. But full-point, yes, I'm going 0 RB because of the injuries and just year-to-year volatile. CMC, he's very volatile. Derrick Henry. So I just try to avoid that type of stuff. But it's half-point PPR, so I got to go with running back.
And as people have pointed out, it's been, I think, 17 seasons since a running back has repeated. Austin, you mentioned you took your spot for a very specific player. Has that player happened yet?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Because I wanted to bring up Naji Harrison. I don't want to get too much into your team, but Naji Harris is a guy where everyone's afraid of the McCaffrey injury. Everyone's afraid of Jonathan Taylor's just inability to repeat because history says he won't repeat. But you've been very much on the Naji Harris RB1 train moving forward. And was that the guy you were targeting at that spot?
No, that was yes, because
obviously
I am trying to follow my rankings, but also that's not why I chose this spot.
Okay.
We can get to that.
We'll talk to that later. Yep. Okay. Then let's not even dig into it at this point, because I wanted you to kind of touch on 0 running back. As much as we've done this show, I don't know that you've ever really talked about 0 running back. And my question to you is, and Faith's pick is coming up here in a second, how far in a PPR or half PPR league are you willing to go before you take your first running back?
So I am not a fan of the 0 running back strategy. Okay. It just like my stomach begins to churn when I think about not having that anchor running back in my lineup. I tend to be more of a safe bet type fantasy player, a more conservative fantasy player, where I am like, I want to get the players that I know I can count on from week to week. And to me, having at least one running back out the gate is a must-have in most situations. I will rarely make it past the second round without a running back. And the only situation where that's happening is if I've gotten, like, if I'm at the 10 or 11, I'm on the turn and I get a Travis Kelce and a Devontae Adams. But then by the time I get to the third round, I'm going to probably do a run of running backs because I want to create that depth. It's just the running back position, and we're going to talk about this in our ranking show. Like, it falls off really quickly, and it's the reason that we're waiting till the last week before the season starts to do our receivers ranking show. Is there's about 50 different receivers that if they're on my lineup, I feel good. But once you get outside of the top 20 to 30 running backs, I start to get really nervous and don't have a lot of confidence in my running back room. So I still prefer, even in full PPR, I prefer to have running backs early. But, for Faith, it really worked out. And she got another one of my guys, David Montgomery, in the fourth round. And I think Montgomery has a chance to be a top 10 running back this year. So if you have some of those players that are low in ADP, but you think have high upside and you are able to land those, I love it. But me personally, I tend to shy away from zero RB.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And right next to Faith, I think it's is it Burn Zone with the Homer Simpson logo. He's kind of going with what has been adopted as the hero RB strategy. And I just kind of want to talk about Christian McCaffrey as the player, TD. Christian McCaffrey is a lightning rod right now because we all know what he can do when he plays, but the when he plays has become a very large part of that sentence. It's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in that sentence right now. So what is your take on Christian McCaffrey this year? And more importantly, if you are at the 102 and JT goes number one, are you a Christian McCaffrey guy or are you going elsewhere?
I'm going elsewhere. Because if you think about the coaches, if you're the coach, Ryan, what are you going to do this year? Are you going to give him the same amount of carries and opportunities? Or are you going to wait till later in the year and let him build up to that side he can last longer?
As someone who happens to actually be covering the Carolina Panthers for Football Guys right now, I can tell you that they are doing their damnedest to protect this man. And If you haven't been following along, Christian McCaffrey took a shot on the sideline from Dietrich Weisse, the defensive end from the New England Patriots. It turned into an all-out team brawl where 3 players got kicked out of it. So they are literally protecting this man right now.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that tells me that extra CMC workload that you got to make him an alpha is going to be gone. Maybe I think in a fantasy championship weeks, he could be great for you, but early on, there's no way they run this man in the ground. If they do that, everybody's going to get fired immediately. So I'm not touching him. Not that his talent is not good. I just don't want to touch him because he's going to be a maintenance guy.
And that brings up an interesting scenario because let's say no injuries, because obviously if he's hurt again, the whole world's going to be afraid of him. But let's bring up no injuries, but he starts slow, 10-point weeks instead of his normal 20-point output. It will be interesting to see the type of trades that go down. And when are you willing? I want to continue with you on this, TD. So he starts off slow because they're protecting him. When are you willing to maybe start throwing out trade offers to grab Christian McCaffrey? Because what if he starts with 3 consecutive 10-point weeks? Are you still convinced, like you just brought up in the fantasy playoffs, he's going to be that guy? Or do we start to worry that maybe he's not the guy anymore?
I would start worried that he's not the guy anymore, that his position may be changed. I've always been saying that they should change his position more to like a guy catching a lot of passes and less carries. So, yes, I would be worried if he starts off with 3 weeks of 10 points.
Interesting. It worked out well for Deebo Samuel last year if they would want to put him in a role like that. So, Austin, quarterbacks are pretty much going exactly how we expect quarterbacks to go, with one very notable difference that I will bring up. But we've had 2 quarterbacks go early. Josh Allen going to our buddy Zach at the end makes perfect sense. Zach is big on Josh Allen. And when you pick from the end, we've talked about it's get your guy territory. Took a full 8 picks before we saw Patrick Mahomes go, but then the entire 5th round gets skipped and we see Herbert and Jackson go back to back. I feel like this is exactly how quarterbacks should go in a fantasy draft for people know what they're doing. And I know that sounds condescending, but this is exactly what I want to see when I go into fantasy drafts. How do you feel about seeing just 4 guys go to this point and where they went, Austin?
Well, given the quarterback still on the board and that I haven't gotten my quarterback yet, I'm still feeling pretty good.
Yeah.
But I really like this. I think this is how the draft should fall. And I think, honestly, like it fell at a point where Josh Allen kind of ended up being a value in the 4th round. Like typically in a lot of leagues, you're having to get him like sometimes in the 2nd round if you actually want him. And it's really striking that he made it to the 4th round. I think the trap that you could fall into here is thinking that this is how fantasy drafts are actually going to play out. And I think what you spoke to, Ryan, is I think we're playing with a lot of people that have been mock drafting fairly frequently. And so they know that they can wait on quarterback. But if you are playing in leagues and you want Josh Allen to be that guy and you're playing with a mix of players, some who are more casual than others, you might not be able to get him in the 4th round. I think, let's see, his ADP on Fantasy Pros right now, he's going as 24th overall.
Yeah. And
so in a 12-team league, the
last pick of the 2nd round. So
exactly. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is this may not be the most representative of how it actually plays in a more casual draft, but still an incredible value.
I want to fight with you a little bit though, because no offense to any of these names, and if they're analysts, I apologize, but these are not the folks who are analysts who have been drafting with us recently. So many new names in the draft. So first and foremost, shout out to all of you for drafting perfectly. Like right now, I'm struggling to come up with where I think you guys screwed up. I just don't see it yet. I'm still waiting for a couple of players to go because there'll be people I can pick on at that point. Let's just jump over to another team. And you know what? Let's start with the top of the draft. So TD, I've already had you talk about Christian McCaffrey and you say you're avoiding him. Are you a part of Jonathan Taylor is not going to repeat as the 101? So are you going super wild card at the 101, or is Jonathan Taylor's top 5 upside still worth grabbing him at the 101 like Kevin did?
If it's full point PPR, I'm going Justin Jefferson. But Jonathan Taylor, I'm not fading him because of what happened in the past. I feel good.
The good things that happened in the past is why we're fading him. I love that.
Exactly. So to me, I'm taking Jonathan Taylor. He's safe. But that's a safe, good one-on-one pick and like a half-point PPR, because reason why I talk about half-point PPR and full-point PPR, it changes my strategy a lot.
I love it.
Half-point PPR, I love running backs. But in full-point, I love running backs, but not as much. I'd rather go wide receiver and 0 RB. But yeah, Jonathan Taylor is the one-on-one. It's a safe one-on-one for me.
Perfect. And I love that you're bringing that up. I'll be honest, it's not something we've actually talked about. This is our 21st, iteration of this show. And the differences in scoring between half point and full point and standard scoring or non-PPR scoring, it's literally why these things were invented. Like if you played fantasy football 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was all standard scoring. It was all non-PPR. But the first 24 picks of your draft, 20 of them were running backs. And it just got boring. Like it was the draft became very formulaic and boring. And then full PPR was added to make wide receivers more valuable. But unfortunately, it made them a little bit too valuable, and then wide receivers were just outscoring everybody, and half PPR is kind of that like subtle medium where you're able to kind of have fun and get the guys you want without being forced into a lane. And so you saying, in every different draft strategy, there is somebody different who can be that 101. And that's one of the things I have a friend yesterday who just did I believe it was a full PPR draft, and he really wanted Justin Jefferson, but he was like, is it a problem if I leave Jonathan Taylor on the board at 101? I said, absolutely not. Justin Jefferson is a guy who could explode this year. And so it was really great hearing you say this. I'll have to send him the clip after the show. It'll make him feel better.
Yep.
So looking at Kevin's team, he went, running back, tight end, 2 wide receivers, quarterback. So he's really filling out his roster, getting Rashad Penny in the 7th round. So just overall with Kevin's team, I find it interesting that he was able to wait until the 4th round to get his first wide receiver, but he got Allen Robinson. I am a big believer in Allen Robinson. Austin, how do we feel about his very first wide receiver? And he doubled up on wide receiver, but his very first wide receiver isn't even his own team's first wide receiver.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Allen Robinson, to me, he's going to be really solid this year. And so I feel really good about this pick. I mean, I have him ranked at wide receiver 19 right now, but he has top 12 upside, particularly in this offense. Like we saw how much of a weapon Odell Beckham was in that offense last year down the stretch. And I think Allen Robinson fits right into that role. Defenses are going to be paying a lot more attention to Cooper Kupp this year, and it could free up Allen Robinson to be more of a weapon. So I feel really good about where he ended up waiting on wide receiver that long. And this is, again, why I tend to take running backs early, is because you can wait on wide receiver and still get some really quality players. I mean, Marquise Brown, he's got the high upside and he's got the stack with Kyler Murray. So that could be a potentially potent weapon, especially when you're drafting. In many ways, you're drafting for the first 6 weeks of the season. And DeAndre Hopkins is going to be out the first 6 weeks of the season. Indeed. The Cardinals, they historically kill it out the gate. They were 6-0 last year. We thought they were about to just run through the league. And so getting a team that can start out hot in a high volume offense and getting their number one receiver, I think is a really great strategy.
And, before we get into, because there's a player who finally went, and you guys were talking about him before the show, and he's probably the lightning rod of fantasy. So I wanted to spend some time talking about Antonio Gibson. But before we get into that, and you had kind of touched on this with Kevin's team, TD, stacking is something that kind of came over from DFS, getting a quarterback and a wide receiver. And I am seeing it so much in just this draft alone. Our buddy Zach, who we were talking about earlier, took Josh Allen. He went ahead and stacked him with Stephon Diggs. Just now we saw Alex Mateo, an Eagles fan, take Jalen Hurts and Devonta Smith, Kevin, Kyler Murray, and Marquise Brown. In a redraft league, just your home league, your work league, fantasy football, do you go into a draft hoping to stack guys? Austin just jumped in on the train as well. Do you go into the draft looking to stack guys, or is that not a focus of yours when you're playing regular redraft fantasy football?
If I can, but I'm not going to ruin my team. I'm not going to fade Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase just to stack somebody with Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp, right? I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to I like to try to stack Trey Lance and Debo and Ayuk or Kittle, but if I can't do it, I'm okay with it. So I don't think you go in there with a plan, I got to stack players. I think if it falls to you, if you're at the 12 or the 101, I think you can do that because you're getting 2 picks back to back, and it's easy to stack that way. But if you're in the middle, you might not be able to do it.
And I like that. And one other thing you kind of hit on, that you're not going to force it, you're not going to ruin your team. Along that same note, it's a piece of advice that I'll go is maybe you just want a part of a player, or you want a part of a quarterback. So maybe you can't get the stack. Maybe you couldn't get Justin Jefferson because you didn't have the 101 in a league with TD and you knew he was taking him. Well, someone who could benefit from that is Kirk Cousins. And I know it's kind of gauche to talk about players who haven't been taken yet, but Kirk Cousins is a guy that you can probably land with one of your last picks. He is a startable fantasy asset, especially in 12-team leagues. And he gives you that piece of Justin Jefferson. So even if you don't plan on stacking, don't be afraid to go get the second or third best wide receiver for your quarterback if he's falling later in the draft. But more importantly, don't be afraid to go get the quarterback of a great wide receiver like Kirk Cousins or Derek Carr, who tend to fall in drafts, but they're tied to these very, very good players. And so that's something like, I love that you brought that up, that don't ruin your team to tell a story. It's kind of the best way to put it. Guys, let's get to Antonio Gibson. Antonio Gibson is the kind of the fire rod of fantasy football right now. He has had a relatively rough preseason. He tends to put the ball on the turf, which is causing some anxiety. And honestly, I just want to let you guys go ahead and talk. Austin, we'll start with you. You guys were having a really great conversation before the show, and I just kind of want you to bring that out for everybody else to know how you guys are looking at Antonio Gibson in fantasy football. He went, quick math tells me, is about the RB 27 right now, which is, I think, 7 spots lower than he was going, but he was the RB 10 in fantasy football last year.
Yeah, I am definitely starting to worry about Antonio Gibson, and I tend to be very careful to buy into preseason hype and preseason narratives because there's a lot of misleading things that can happen during the preseason. But I've started to feel nervous about Gibson since the NFL draft. When Washington drafted Brian Robinson in the 3rd round, that's like pretty decent for a running back. Like, running backs, if they're in the top 3 rounds, you're like, okay, teams like this, because running backs are valued way less by NFL teams than they are by fantasy football players. And so that was the first moment where I was kind of like, okay, a little bit worried about this guy. Then I was watching Brian Robinson tape a bit more and noticed that he filled he was very much in between the tackles running back for Alabama, which is kind of what Antonio Gibson has tended to be over the past couple of years. He's tended to be the first down, go get 3 to 5 yards, and then J.D. McKissic has played the receiving back role. So those were two kind of signs before the preseason ever began that made me nervous. What's making me nervous now is, first off, J.D. McKissic is not playing in preseason games. He didn't play this weekend, which to me says he's a lock to be playing for this team, and he has a role in this offense. Antonio Gibson, when I went back and watched, I didn't see him take a handoff most of the game. I think he had 2 rushes that went for like 3 or 4 yards total this weekend, but most of the time he was being utilized in the play action pass game and in the pass game in general, which is good. Like, you want him to be catching passes, but if he's going to be fighting for receptions with J.D. McKissic and Brian Robinson's going to be playing that in between the tackles role, I start to worry about Gibson's role in this offense. Again, it's preseason. We'll know more information on week 1, but I don't feel comfortable having Gibson as a running back 1 this year, even though he finished as 1 last year. And I feel nervous about having him as a running back 2.
Okay. And TD, just continue with that same thought, but my question to you specifically is 7th round. Is this somewhere where we're comfortable with him, or are you still looking past him at this point?
It just depends on what kind of build I'm doing. But if he's just the bench player, yeah, I'm willing to take that. Like you said, he's got capital of being a top 10 player the last 2 years. But listen, this is what I say, and I go to more of the X's and O's. I'm not going to sit here and say like I'm a coach, but Ron Rivera has failed terribly. He's killed Antonio Gibson's career so far. Whew. And I know that, work with me here. And the reason why is this guy had 33 carries in college. Why are you using him as an I-formation Nigerian nightmare type running back?
Yeah.
That's not who he is. He is Debo, and I know I use Debo a lot, but I love, because I've been talking about hybrid players for 5 years. Nobody wanted to hear me talk about hybrid players.
and now you're in the spotlight.
The game was going to that. So with Antonio Gibson, he should be catching 7 or 8 balls a game and probably getting 7 or 8 carries. That's why he's fumbling, because he's a wide receiver. If Debo got 300 carries, how many times would he fumble?
Very true.
And
I love that.
I think that's one of the really notable points about Gibson that you bring up, TD, is he could play that Debo role. And I've seen that starting to float around. It's like, oh, this is why you should still draft him. It's because he could be a Debo Samuel type player. But if you watch his lineups in that preseason game, he never once lined up in a wide receiver slot. He only ever came out of the backfield. And so it's not happening right now. Like, it should be. And maybe with a different coach, it would, but it's just not.
You hit the nail on the head. And that's what I wanted to bring up, is we're dealing with the Ron Rivera, Norv Turner, Scott Turner type offense, where I kind of hit on this last year. Everyone got super excited when Curtis Samuel signed in Washington. But they forgot that we were just bitching about how Curtis Samuel was never used properly in Carolina for years. Yeah. And now he's right back with that same coaching staff. And then, I mean, he didn't play much last year because of injury, but he wasn't utilized properly. So expecting Scott Turner and Ron Rivera to use somebody like Debo Samuel, don't hold your breath on that one. It's not going to happen. They're boring. And I think saying, that Ron Rivera has wasted Antonio Gibson, I absolutely love that take, because he is a different type player. And we see that through the NFL is when these new guys come in and people don't know how to use them, it takes that first coach to unlock them. And so maybe Antonio Gibson's value is going to be with the next team he lines up with. So he could end up being a very big post-type sleeper. TD, there are 3 running backs who I've kind of lumped into a group this year, and their ADPs are typically pretty close, but they went kind of different in this draft. And that's Travis Etienne, Cam Akers, and J.K. Dobbins. These are all guys who are coming off of injuries from last year. And obviously, Akers had the miraculous comeback. We saw Etienne going at 3.9. Akers go just 5 picks later at 4.2. And then Dobbins fall all the way to 6.7. And what I find interesting about this is, of the 3 injuries, Dobbins has the most recoverable and safe injury. So what are your take on those guys? Are the other 2 guys going far too early? Is Dobbins going too late? Just what are your take on running back coming off of that, off of injuries there from last year?
You said Cam Akers and J.K. Dobbins, and what was the other one?
Travis Etienne.
I haven't taken none of these backs. sometimes in fantasy, nobody says this. Sometimes I'm not trying to play like what I know what's going to happen. I just avoid them. I feel like there's other players around the ADPs that I'd rather have instead of these guys. I don't want to wait on Dobbins to get back right. ETN, do I want to go to the Jacksonville Jaguars offense? I don't know. I mean, ETN probably would be the guy that I would rather take than any of these other guys. But I'm just kind of fading. I don't think I have none of these guys on none of my fantasy teams.
And Austin, just continue with that. So I love that you said nobody's saying it. That has kind of been my in-season motto. Like, if a guy is questionable, I'm just going to start the guy who's not questionable every week, because it takes one more pulled hamstring to get 0 points in the first quarter. And so it's something I incorporated into my in-week, but I will gamble a little bit when I'm building my team. I am notoriously anti-Cam Akers because I just don't think the Achilles injury is one you can come back from this quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It was just interesting to me to see Dobbins go almost 3 full rounds after Travis Etienne. And they're very similar in age, similar in offense, if you will, where Etienne's going to be a heavy reception guy. Dobbins should be a heavy rushing guy with more touchdown upside. So it was interesting to see the 3-round gap there, Austin.
Yeah, it is interesting to see the gap there. I think people have just been buying the hype on Etienne. And I really don't get why Dobbins has fallen as much as he had. But I agree with TD. Like, when I'm drafting these players, I don't really want them as my top 2 unless I may be in a best ball format where I can draft them early and then get some other dart throw running backs later on. But in redraft, I feel nervous about taking particularly ETN because we haven't seen him play NFL football. And that's a big factor to me. I want to know what these players look like in the NFL. I'm more willing to take Cam Akers because I do believe Sean McVay likes to focus on one running back at a time. And so I think he'll have the volume to be able to be an effective fantasy running back. And because it's redraft, again, I'm drafting for the team that I'm starting the season with. And starting the season with Cam Akers, I'm a fan of. I might not finish the season with Cam Akers because he might get hurt. But if he wins me my first 3 weeks, that is a significant boost to getting me to the fantasy playoffs later on.
I like it. A lot of things right now, running backs seem to be the most interesting topic. Like, I'm looking through the draft board trying to find things to ask you guys about. And every time I find someone, it's a running back. And so, TD, I want to go with another running back. I'm going to keep the trend going here. This is a guy I wonder, the hype on Twitter, the drumbeat is getting very loud, but it is not caught up to ADP yet. And it hasn't caught up to some of the leagues I'm in yet. We just saw Damian Pierce go from Axe Harding at the 9-7. Damian Pierce, it is looking like, and you guys both talked about this, guys who aren't playing in the preseason, it tends to mean they have their job locked down. Damian Pierce did not appear in the Texans' second preseason game. So what is your take on Damian Pierce? Obviously, the Texans are not a good football team. Damian Pierce doesn't have a lot of draft capital, but it seems like it's his job already. Is he 9th round feels about right for him, maybe a little bit earlier? What's your take on Damian Pierce this season for folks who probably have no idea who he is?
So I would take Damien Pierce over those 3 guys you talked to me earlier. That's why I was saying.
Really?
Yes, I would. Easily. I love Davis Mills. Davis Mills actually is the youngest quarterback from last year that I like out of all those guys that were drafted, because he showed me he was on a bad, terrible, offensive scheme to me, and he was had the whole Deshaun Watson pressure over him, and he still played really well. And he hyper-targeted Brandon Cooks. That takes a lot for a young quarterback to hyper-target an alpha wide receiver. So I think Damian Pierce is going to have plenty of opportunities to score. And I just don't think Marlon Mack and Rex Burkhead can keep up with him.
I absolutely love that take. Austin, please continue on Pierce if you can.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with this take. The more that I think about it, the more it makes sense, because here's the thing. James Robinson still exists in Jacksonville. And
did not go on the pup for folks. Obviously, he tore his ACL towards our Achilles at the end of last year, an injury I just told you I'm very much against. But I will say he did not go on the pup, and he is going to be a thorn in the side of Travis Etienne. But please continue.
Yeah, so he could diminish Etienne's value. And then J.K. Dobbins, I mean, the Baltimore Ravens, they use a running back by committee. People may not like that, but it's going to probably be Dobbins and maybe Mike Davis out there running with Lamar Jackson. So you've got 3 different running options there. And then I think the other one, Cam Akers, I think it's more likely he's the workhorse in that offense. So maybe you take Cam Akers over Damian Pierce, but Pierce has a chance to be the number one running back, getting 3 down work in that offense. And those other guys, it's a little bit, it's from questionable to definitely they're in a committee.
And you kind of hit the committee point. I want to bring Josh's comment up on the screen. And TD, this is something you've been talking about all show so far. So I'm going to bring this back to you. But first, I'm going to get you uncovered by this comment, is that J.K. Dobbins is not going to catch more than 25 passes. So you had mentioned, in full PPR versus half PPR, you'll start to lean running backs. Does a guy like Dobbins, and then more importantly, a guy like Nick Chubb, who will not catch a lot of passes, how far do they start to fall for you based on the scoring? Are they guys that you'll just flat out avoid if they're not catching balls?
This is the first time I drafted Nick Chubb this year, because this is the first mock draft that I did that was half-point PPR.
Okay, there you go.
So, yeah, that's why you see me go full running backs. I haven't done that all year, but it's half-point PPR. So that brought up Nick Chubb, Connor, and that made me go Dylan, like right off the gate.
And you hit one of my favorite things you've said so far is that you would take Damian Pierce over those 3 running backs. And I hope I'm not putting words into your mouth here, but when I hear great stories like that, I feel like I need to point out, you're not necessarily saying you're going to take them, because you don't need to draft Damian Pierce in the 4th round. The point is, don't take a running back where you would have normally taken those 3 injured guys and wait and get Damian Pierce later in the draft. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, that's a fair assessment. Yep.
Perfect.
That's what I'm saying. That's because to me, it's not saying I'm going to draft Damian Pierce there, but I'm going to wait late. That's where like 0 RB guys, where those, I know that like tier of running backs, because I'm a 0 RB guy. So I like Penny. I like Pierce. I like James Cook a little bit. I also like Devin Singletary. I like those guys around that ADP.
Perfect. And that's one of the points I've been trying to get across from this show for 21 episodes now is some people will look at a mock draft and scoff. They don't understand the point of it. The point of a mock draft, and I would even tell you, we mock draft on Sleeper because the interface is the prettiest and it makes it easiest to do a show. Do your mock drafts on the site where you are going to be drafting, because learning where players are going to go is the most valuable information you can come in outside of knowing your league scoring. Because if you know Damian Pierce is a 9th round pick and you know you're going to skip Travis Etienne, Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins in the 4th, 5th, and 6th round, you know that you can take Damian Pierce in the 8th to make sure you get him. And you just got a guy that someone who knows what they're talking about, TD Good, told you he likes him better than those 4 guys who went ahead of him. And that's where knowing ADP and using mocks to your advantage really comes into play here. As we're winding down on the draft, for those who are new to the show, TD and Austin are going to talk about their entire draft strategy at the end of the show, things they had to change, things they didn't have to change. We don't go through every team. We used to pick a winner, but I'll be honest, it wasn't great for TV, so we're not going to do it anymore. But I did notice that every team after the 10-4 had already had their starting quarterback. And I find this interesting. And really, I want to talk specifically about Hawk 707. And why I want to talk about him is he was the last one to take his quarterback. And when I am the last one to take my quarterback, I like to play a game where I will wait as late as possible. I will usually queue about the last 5 guys I'm comfortable with as my starting quarterback, and I won't take them until like 3 of those guys go. How do you guys in your home league draft, and obviously you have to know your league. So TD, are you typically, you went quarterback a little bit early here, but in a league like this, if you're the last person to take your quarterback, do you jump on your guy this early? Notoriously, there was a draft where I forgot to take a quarterback and still got Kirk Cousins in the 14th round. And so I would have waited a little bit longer here. How do you feel about being the last person to take your quarterback in the draft?
I love it. To me, it depends on, so when I seen Justin Herbert come off the board and I looked at the rest of the players, there wasn't any players that I wanted to take and fade Lamar Jackson and wait late to get Kirk Cousins. Lamar Jackson was too good of a value. That's why I took him. But I think I like to play the game that you play. If I could get Kirk Cousins and y'all let him wait that long and I can stack my team, that's what I'm going to do. Yep.
Austin, please continue with that thought, just because we talk about quarterbacks all the time and we're probably not going to hit on them again in this draft, because I found it. I feel the ADP went very well. It's just interesting to me that we had a full round gap between the 11th and 12th quarterback taken.
Well, and what's getting me right now is the same thing that got me on our quarterback ranking show this past Thursday, is that Aaron Rodgers is still out there.
Yeah.
That, like, I took Dak Prescott in the 8th round when I did, because I was like, okay, you know what? Dak Prescott, he's often like taken in the first 5 to 7
100%.
quarterbacks. And I was like, it's a value. Sure. Why not? I'll do it. I didn't even think about the fact that I was stacking him with Schultz. But now I'm like, I could have gotten Aaron Rodgers, who's never finished outside of the top 10 in fantasy football in, at this rate, the 14th, 15th round. And I think that just emphasizes the point of, you can wait on quarterback. You may not have the rushing upside of a Lamar Jackson, but instead of that, you're going to get a solid receiver, tight end, running back, and keep the positional value at those other positions.
And Kevin went ahead and took care of that Aaron Rodgers thing for you. So still goes off the board at QB 14, which I know breaks your heart. TD, what's your take on DeAndre Hopkins, Michael Thomas? Don Flick took both of them at just after you at the 5'11", just before Zach. Taking one makes a little bit of sense. Taking two is a little scary to me. And so he took his quarterback earlier than most people took their quarterback, though the 6 isn't too bad. But he bookends it with Michael Thomas and DeAndre Hopkins, who are full of question marks right now. What are your take on those two wide receivers?
I think that's a calculated risk to take, because you can work the waiver wire. If those guys are not ready to come back, you got to wait for the suspension. I think you can work the waiver wire with some of these young rookie wide receivers. And when they come back, look what your team can be. The opportunity cost for what it can be. Now, it's edgy. It could cost you a season, but you can't win fantasy championship being safe. So I like that. I think he's got Michael Thomas and D-Hop. I think those guys could be top 12 fringe line wide receivers.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. They're also competing to be his wide receiver 3. You can't see his entire build right now, but he got Devontae Adams in the second round. So it's interesting that you bring up the build, because it is a very interesting build where you're taking these guys who have cleared number 1 overall rule the world wide receiver 1 ceiling, because we've seen it from them. They're obviously a little bit older now, but you're plugging them in as your wide receiver 2 in a league where you only have to start 2 wide receivers, which I think is very important. Don Flick in general has a very risky team, though, because Kenneth Walker, they just said with his I don't even know what they're calling it now, a groin injury versus a hernia. They're not quite saying, just that he's tender, and now they're not 100% sure he's going to be ready for week 1. So Don Flick, it's a mock, but you went very, very risky with this mock at this point. So I also find it interesting, guys, that we've talked about the tight ends very often. The initial tight end run went exactly how it goes in every single draft at this point. TD, I'm going to talk about your tight end in a little bit, but I also see you've now back-ended. But I still find it interesting. I believe we still have multiple teams who have not drafted a tight end yet, if I'm not mistaken, at least. No, I think I am mistaken. They're just not showing up on the board. So never mind. That is not a great comment here. But with these late-round tight ends, I'll just have you both pick right now, because you both already drafted your tight ends. Who are the guys you're targeting late if you don't get an early tight end, Austin?
Yeah. I mean, in my rankings, my tight end 10 right now is Austin Hooper, because I think he's a big receiving threat in that Tennessee offense. They've got to throw the ball to someone outside of Treylon Burks, and Robert Woods may or may not be starting week 1, and he may not be at 100% week 1, even if he does start. So I like Austin Hooper late. Of the tight ends that have gone late in this round, I think, to me, I look at Dawson Knox and Pat Freiermuth, because they are both touchdown upside tight ends in my mind that I like to target. So I think those are some of the ones I'm looking at later at this stage of the draft. Yeah, don't have much.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh. Josh is going at the Komet pick. And you know what? Actually, TD, rather than have you talk about late round tight ends, we're about 10 minutes away from when I end the show, because I end the show at noon. I actually just want to get into your team, because you made some very interesting picks. I love everything you did early. You got some of my absolute favorite players. I love the 4 running back strategy, because I set this league up with 2 flex spots, so you can start 4 running backs. But you went kicker far earlier, and you grabbed Cole Kmet. So for the Club Fantasy family, you're going to have some explaining to do. So I have your team highlighted up on the screen right now. Let's just talk about your draft strategy. You mentioned many times that you approach things different with a half PPR strategy. So just talk about what you came into this draft looking at, if it went the way you wanted it to go. You don't have to talk about every pick, but please talk to us about your team.
So I'll start with the kicker. And excuse me for my language. I'm gonna try to be PG with this
you
one.
can say whatever you want on this show.
I treat my kickers and defense like I do my women. I want to be the first one and only one in there early. And I really mean that. I don't like getting sloppy seconds on those type of positions. Even tight end, but it just depends if I got some other guys. But kickers, I got to move in and get the guy that I want. Same thing when it comes to DST. I got to get the team that I want. So that's why I got Justin Tucker and I went in there early, because I believe if you get the right guy, and the way kickers matter to most leagues, that can be a league-winning move. So yeah, I went heavy RB early because it was half-point PPR. I love those running backs. I love Dylan. Dylan is a guy that I feel like can be a top 12 guy. I wouldn't mind if I could draft Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon, and I would play them both on the same team. A lot of people don't like doing that, but I like squeezing a backfield when I know it's a premium backfield. Like Aaron Rodgers, this team's going to be scoring a lot. Yeah. Okay, let me move down. Let me see some of my other picks here. Yes, so Komet. It's like this. They don't have a lot of weapons. So that actually moves Komet up. I know as far as the offense you don't like, but this defense is not going to be good. So they're going to be chasing points. Absolutely. So when they down by 21 points in the third quarter and Cole Komet just catching a long 30-yard touchdown when nobody was really on him because the game is over, I'm going to like that, right? That's why I got Cole Komet. I don't think Velus Jones or Brian Pringle is going to get more targets than Cole Komet on this team. I think it's going to be Darnell Mooney, Cole Komet, and then the run game.
So I pick often on Cole Komet, but I want to give you one positive here. You were the last person to take your starting tight end. So it doesn't bother me that your starting tight end is Cole Komet when you're the last person to grab your starting tight end. As far as I can tell, maybe Alberto, but I think it was you. So grabbing him as the last tight end starter in a 12-team league is not the worst thing in the world. You're betting on upside, or hopefully you're going to stream the position later on. The 9th round, I feel like there were other players.
Yes, and I understand. I'm looking here. It wasn't any guys that I really think made a difference for my team. Okay. Because some like Gainwell maybe, but I already had 4 running backs. It was just going to be a bench player. I needed a starter, so that's why I went on and got Komet at that particular time. And Njoku, I love Njoku. I think Njoku has a chance to finish as a top 5 guy. I know that's a little edgy, but I love Njoku this year. They gonna hyper target him. They don't have Deshaun Watson won't be playing for the first 11 weeks, so that's a tight end friendly type opportunity, a situation, because I don't think Jacoby Brissett can get the ball to Amari Cooper. I think Njoku's get a lot of targets, so that's why I took Njoku. And I love the Green Bay Packers defense. I think that's the number 1 defense this year.
I was going to say, you brought up that you like to get your defense earlier, make sure you get your guy, but it looks like you probably know the Packers don't get drafted in most leagues. So.
Yes, there you go. 100%. Yep.
I absolutely love it. And like I said, the Njoku thing is interesting because as someone, I'm actually covering the Browns for Football Guys as well. Njoku and Brissett are formulating very much chemistry right now. And I think it's very interesting that you said that, Jacoby Brissett might not be a guy who can hyper target Amari Cooper, but Njoku is going to play much closer to the line. So Thank you so much for that. The kicker early thing, you see that in a lot of leagues, and it's not something that I agree with, but I will say there's nothing wrong with fantasy in getting your guy. And if you believe like TD that Justin Tucker, or in my case, Evan McPherson, is going to be the number 1 kicker, once you have your starters lined up, and like TD said, if you're looking at your draft board and there's nobody there who's going to help your team, why not get your guy? You're going to feel a lot better if you love Justin Tucker and he's on your team than you're going to feel if he's not on your team. So Yep. Austin, let's jump over to your team, buddy. So you mentioned you had a strategy around this pick. I'm just going to let you go to it.
Yeah, so I picked, I guess that was the 108, and I picked it very specifically because I wanted to see if I could get Alvin Kamara in the 2nd round, and his ADP on Sleeper right now is about the 15th spot, and I ended up getting the 15th spot at the 108, or the 15th, 16th spot at the 108. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is mostly because from everything that I'm starting to see, it's looking like Alvin Kamara's potential suspension is going to be delayed until 2023. His lawyers have continued to kind of push back the hearing on his case. Right now, my understanding is the date is September 28th. It stands to reason that they would continue to push it back. So it's very likely that suspension falls to next year. And I haven't decided if I'm actually going to draft Kamara yet or not, because like we've talked about before on this show, you want to have players on your team that you are excited about pulling for. And I haven't quite decided if I'm there yet, but I wanted to demonstrate that I think from a fantasy perspective, Kamara is a really valuable asset right now. Apart from that, I wanted to talk about Tyler Lockett. I tweeted this out. I've now moved him ahead of DK Metcalf in my rankings.
Whoa.
And the reason for that is purely because I think Geno Smith is going to be the starter. And last year, when Russell Wilson played, he had 417 pass attempts. And in those attempts, DK Metcalf had a 26.6% target share. Tyler Lockett only had a 20% target share. But in the 3 games that Geno Smith started, he had 78 pass attempts, so it's a bit of a small sample size. But in those games, DK Metcalf dropped to a 23% target share, and Tyler Lockett went up to a 29.5% target share. And I buy into chemistry between quarterbacks and receivers. I think it's why part of why Davante Adams has been such an asset for the past several years is because when Aaron Rodgers drops back, he is looking for Davante Adams. And if I'm looking for a talented receiver in kind of a meh offense, I want to look at the guy that has the most chemistry with the quarterback. And to me, that's going to be Tyler Lockett. The last thing I want to cover on my team is actually my defense. I'm going to be posting my top 12 defensive rankings today. And I have the Indianapolis Colts as my number 1 defense for fantasy this year.
So do I.
Part of that is because when I look at these defenses, I look a lot at strength of schedule more than I do just the pure talent. And to give a small sample size, the first 2 weeks of the season, the Indianapolis Colts play the Houston Texans and then the Jacksonville Jaguars. They also play the Jaguars twice throughout the year, so they're going to have an easy schedule. And then going down the stretch, the fantasy playoffs is going to be a little tough for them because they play the Cowboys and the Vikings, 2 pass-heavy offenses, and then they play the Chargers. But week 17, they play the New York Giants, and that could be a really interesting game for them.
A league winner.
And so, you've got them. You can take them early, get those first couple of weeks where they will help boost your team. And then you might have to stream another defense the week after that because they play Kansas City. But I like them. And in the preseason, they've been creating turnovers so far, which is a big upside for your fantasy defense.
Boom. So for my oops of the draft, and for those who are new to the show, basically I just look for things where I think someone can learn from these mistakes. It's actually pretty obvious to me. If you just look at the draft board right now, I'm seeing far too much orange. I want to give Alex Mateo a little bit of a pass here. He fat fingered Dallas Goedert. He did not mean to grab a second tight end there. Don't feel pressured into grabbing a second tight end, especially if you got an elite tight end early. And I see so many of these teams that have Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts adding a second tight end. Don't do that. These guys are going to be on waivers because you're going to find a wide receiver or a running back you like more. TD's case, I actually think it's a good call. If you're going to be one of the last guys to take a tight end, feel free to take 2. But if you've already spent an early pick on a tight end, don't waste a second pick on tight end. So that would be my oops of the draft is don't feel forced to grab a second tight end. And let me go ahead and get everybody up on the screen here. TD, thank you so much. I am so glad Austin met you through Scott Fish. What I'd like you to do is tell people where they can find you. Tell people what you're working on. If you are not following this man's YouTube channel, I have it in the description. I'm going to be honest, when Austin introduced me to TD, I went and watched his channels. I fell in love. Your intro is stuck in my head pretty much all the time. So I really appreciate the content you're putting out. It's so easy to consume. So please tell people what you're working on and where they can find it.
So yes, guys, I've been doing YouTube for this will be my 3rd year. So you can follow me at Fantasy Good Sports as you see on the screen at YouTube or any social media from TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Discord. You can find me at Fantasy Good Sports, no spaces. Yes, guys, I also have an OnlyFans. And no, let me explain. I'm not taking off any clothes or anything like that. I just wanted to be different. Everybody had Patreon, right? So how am I like, go follow my Patreon? Everybody like, oh, okay. So OnlyFans, you see, I got the reaction out of you, Ryan. That's why I did OnlyFans. So, guys, you can follow me on OnlyFans. I got a lot of listener leagues this year. I got 5 or 6 dynasties. So if you want to get in a redraft, guys, just hit me up. It's only $10 a month. And also, guys, I answer any questions that you have for me. I can rate your teams. It's very personable. Also, I'm gonna have call-in shows on live this year, far as on Sunday morning. So, guys, you want to follow me on all platforms. And thank you for having me, Ryan.
Oh, absolute pleasure. You've absolutely crushed it. You're the first person to defend taking a kicker in single digit rounds. So that kind of strategy alone is worth the $10 a month. No,
Yeah.
Austin, other than our ranking show, you have anything you want to pitch right now? Tell the people goodbye.
I have nothing to pitch. Just follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Austin_FFL. I'm hoping to do a bit more of my engagement on Instagram these days and get some more interaction with folks doing the ask me anythings and interacting with folks through stories and reels. So follow me there if you're not already, and looking forward to helping everyone win their leagues.
Perfect. If you're not familiar with Club Fantasy, we are large supporters of all women in fantasy football, and the month of August is where we dedicate our Wednesday show to the Women of Fantasy Football, hosted by Faith Enes and Kelly Singh. This week, it's the ESPN week. If you want great guests, you need to be there Wednesday at 7 o'clock. We have ESPN's Brooke Pryor and ESPN's Stefania Bell on the show. Not to mention the raffles we have going on right now. We are giving away an autographed Jamar Chase jersey and an autographed Deion Sanders jersey. Those are only $5 to enter, with all proceeds going to Laura Oakman's Galvanize. We very much support all the women in this industry. If you're not following the Women of Fantasy Football handle, women_FF, I always get that mixed up. Make sure you're following that. It'll have all the details on the raffles, all the details on the show, and I have the links in the description. It's a very important cause. It's something you want to be a part of, and who doesn't want autographed merchandise? On top of that, we have our ranking show, as Austin mentioned earlier, where since we're not on Wednesday, on Thursday, we are going to be going over our running back rankings this week. That's going to be Thursday at 7 o'clock. On the website, you'll find 32 player profiles plus our rankings there that we'll be arguing about on Thursday. But far more importantly, well, not more importantly, the Women of Fantasy is the way more important part. That was a terrible choice of phrasing on my part. But this show will be back one last time next week. Next week is going to be our final episode. I'm not quite sure who the guests are. I have some emails out right now. We are going to be doing a 12-team full PPR mock draft, just like you're doing in your home leagues right now. It's the last show to get you ready for the season. Go follow Women of Fantasy Football. Go enter those raffles. We thank everybody for joining us, and have a great day.